So you have the review for the final exam. It says it starts at 8 a.m., but I'm going to check with you guys and see if people want to come at 9. So write 9 with a question mark, 9 to 11, and just make sure that none of your other classes, did you not get one? None of your other classes conflict with that. So 9 to 11 with a question mark. On Monday. It says right there. Oh, the final exam will be on Monday, December 4th at 8 a.m. That's the that's what I'm supposed to have it. So it's on this piece of paper like that. But I really like to have it at 9. I would think I'm down with that. Okay. So remember that the final exam is cumulative, which means that it can have anything on it, but the majority of it, 70%, is going to be over what we have covered since the midterm. So you need to study accordingly. And the only essay questions that are going to be on the final exam are these. Which one? Yes. All of them? All of them. No, 2 or 3 of them will be on the final exam.
2 or 3?
2 or 3. And remember that I always have a bonus question, which is what was the most significant thing you learned in giving scientific details. So remember, I'm just telling Lakin that because she's the only one who hasn't been in class, and all my other final exams have had that question on it for you guys, so you probably should expect it coming.
The grade book has like chapter 27 quizzes a couple times.
Yes, I need to delete that.
And then our last quiz 7 for this is the take-home quiz. It says like take quiz 7. Take
oh, that was from last time I taught this class, so that probably is not the case.
So
there's only 6.
So are you not dropping one?
No, I'll have a 7.
Okay.
I don't know if it's going to be take-home though.
Okay.
I don't know if it's going to be take-home. Sorry. So I just rolled my 233 class over.
It should be take-home.
Yeah.
People forget to bring their take-home quizzes back.
Yeah, because
we won't forget.
I need a 15.
Let's make a pact. We won't forget.
My other classes, I've been giving out homework assignments, my 100 level classes, and I'm like, this is to help you, not to hurt you, and then only like half of them turn it back in, and it's the half that doesn't need. It's like, you guys, you have to turn in your homework.
It's easy point.
That's the easier points. Okay. Okay, so we were talking about the reproductive system, and one thing, where's the pen? I did not walk off with that pen. Somebody else walked off with it. I'm going to go steal one out of there.
No.
There's only had like 2 labs. What's the date of the practical?
No, she said
It's like a Friday. It's a Friday from this, a week from this Friday.
It's December 1st.
Next.
We don't have lab next week, and the next week we have our lab.
No, because
This week.
I already watched the lecture.
Huh? No, next week.
It's next week?
Okay.
She told me it was like super.
Dear.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible.
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to go.
But she's.
And on Wednesday, we don't have a class, so I said I just make it a minute, but I'm not gonna actually make it. It's a good idea.
Hey, I think she sent you a picture of the case study.
Oh, yeah.
We had another case study?
Yeah, we have one.
It's like, if
we do it, they drop the lowest case study.
Oh, good.
We got a 4 or 5 on one, so
That's what
she'll give us a 5, yeah.
Yeah.
So actually kind of works.
Is it hard? Shoot, I thought another.
No, it's like, we're pretty sure. Shelly, what do we think it was?
I think it's Ebola.
We think it's Ebola because he was in Africa.
Is he dead?
No, he just has flu-like symptoms.
And one of the options was TSS.
Toxic shock syndrome?
Yeah, he's a 52-year-old man.
Can they even get
Right?
I
And
actually knew
HIV was
that.
one. Which that's like the second most likely because if he's getting like AIDS, then he just has flu starts. His immune system's weak. Because he said it was there for like what, 3 weeks, right?
Yeah.
So.
He couldn't be both 18 weeks. Is he alive?
Okay, so I forgot to mention, so if you would go back into your notes and find that male sexual response, I forgot to mention one thing, which was the bulbal urethral glands, and of course this does not work. It's having one of these horrible things.
Yeah.
Reproduction.
I remember that. Well, because technically it's and that produces testosterone. That's why I said
Her pen problem.
Yeah.
I just have to write on the board.
I mean, like,
The old school way. Yeah. Uh-huh.
It produces the hormone.
The light went on. Okay.
I said that wrong before, I actually did it.
Okay, so remember the accessory glands were the seminal vesicles, but also the prostate gland, and they contribute to the seminal fluid, which is what comes out with the ejaculate. So the ejaculate does not just contain sperm, but also contains all the other stuff that is added to it. Now there is a gland that doesn't contribute to the seminal fluid, but creates what is referred to as the pre-seminal fluid. And the one thing that this seems to function as, or function for, is it helps to lubricate, so it helps in lubrication. So lubrication of the urethra, but also of the penis, okay? And it also functions to rid the urethra of urine. Because remember, urine can be acidic, and that acid will actually kill the sperm. And so we don't want the urethra to be acidic, so the pre-seminal fluid helps to decrease the acidity. Okay? So I'll put in parentheses, decreases acidity. Okay. So if we look at the structure, oops, here they are. They're in that picture too. So this would be the paired seminal vesicles right here. Then we have the prostate gland, which is just one prostate gland. Notice that the urethra, the prostatic urethra, travels through there. And then we have the paired bulbal urethral glands, which are located right here. So they actually sit below the prostate gland, and they would secrete their substances via a duct into the urethra, and then would come out through the tip of the penis, which is called the glans penis. There's another diagram, which is probably more likely to be on the exam, which looks like this, right? So here, the seminal vesicles are located up here. Here's the prostate gland, and here is the bulbal urethral gland, and you can see the duct, right? So this would be an example of an endocrine or exocrine gland. Exocrine, right? Because it secretes its substances via a duct. Okay. The other structures that we've talked about would include the testes, where the seminiferous tubules reside. This structure right around the testes is called the what? The epididymis, and that is where the sperm is stored. And then when the ejaculation happens, yes, so the Vas Deferens. So sometimes males choose to have that severed, that connection, and that would prevent sperm from being in the ejaculate. And so that is called a what? Vasectomy, right? Right? So if you look at that, that is cutting of the vas, right? So that is where the Vas Deferens is cut. Now, I want you to remember that this does not travel alone. So what is the whole structure that the vas deferens travels in as it comes back into the body cavity? It's called a cord, but it's called the spermatic cord, right? So this is the whole spermatic cord. And so remember that the spermatic cord contains the vas deferens, but it also contains the blood vessels. And you'll notice that there's this network of blood vessels, which is called the plexus. And we talk about plexuses not in the circulatory system, but in the nervous system. So if you talk about like the cervical plexus, that is the neurons, the branching and the coming back together of the neurons from the cervical region of the spinal cord. And so this is the campaniform plexus, and it surrounds the arteries that are bringing blood in, and it helps to cool the blood as it enters the testes. You can also see this would be the cremaster muscle, and then the muscle that is inside the scrotal sac is called the dartus muscle, and that is smooth muscle. And so remember that the whole point of those muscles would be to help to regulate the temperature of the testes during sperm production, so that you have kind of a constant, relatively cooler temperature of the testes than in the body cavity. Are there any questions about that idea? Anything else that we talked about? Okay. So we are actually going to move on to the female reproductive system today. And then we're going to compare them. We talked about hormonal control. Okay. So like the males, the females have gonads. And these gonads are called ovaries. Unlike the males, however, the ovaries are up in the body cavity and they're well protected. So during oogenesis, during the formation of the egg, it doesn't seem to matter what temperature that happens at. It needs to be relatively warm, obviously, because it's warmer inside the body cavity. So they're more protected up inside the body cavity. Now, the ovaries are not directly connected to the rest of the reproductive tract. And this has to do, we'll look at it in a little bit, but this has to do with the fact that when you are first born and early on in embryonic development, you have two sets of ducts. And you can either become a male or a female. And then early on, like at 6 weeks, you start to diverge. And so if you have a Y chromosome, you will start to develop a testes, and the duct that is right connected to the testes becomes the vas deferens. And if you're female, in your XX, you lack the Y, then the duct that is a little bit away from the gonad itself becomes the oviduct, or the fallopian tubes. And so this is probably the reason why it's not connected, directly connected, is probably kind of an evolutionary constraint because of the way that the ducts are set up during early embryonic development, so that you can become either male or female, depending upon your genotype. So we can talk about what is called the oviduct. So you probably have heard of this being referred to as the fallopian tubes, right? Not the esophagus, oviducts. And they have different structures. And so at the proximal end, so this is the end that is closest to the uterus. So the proximal end connects to the uterus. Near the proximal end, there's a structure or a part of this which is called the isthmus. And does anybody remember what that means from lab? Geographically, it means like a little connection from one landmass to another, right? And so it's a narrow connection. And so the isthmus is kind of where we see that it narrows down. So it goes through a narrowing, and then it gets a little bit larger. So that's the narrowing of the fallopian tube. I'm not sure what the function of that isthmus is. But at the distal end, which is the end that is near the ovary, we have what is called the ampulla. And the ampulla is a little turn in the fallopian tube. And at the end of the ampulla, we have the fimbriae. So we'll put ampulla with with infundibulum. So that's an ampulla with the infundibulum. And the infundibulum, I kind of like to think of it as almost like a catcher's mitt, right? It's this opening that is going to suck the egg up into it once the egg has been ovulated from the ovary. Okay. Okay, so the infundibula has fimbriae. So I'll put has fimbriae. And do you know what fimbriae means? Yes, so finger-like extensions. Okay, and so that is actually going to catch the egg once it is ovulated. So this catches egg once ovulated. Okay, so let's look at the diagram in your book. So this shows the different parts, and this is just one perception of it. So the ovary is located right here. This is the ampulla where it kind of comes here, and then this is like the infundibulum, and this would be the fimbriae. And so those are not directly connected, and so it creates a current. And the current is created by ciliated cells. So the cells that line that create a current, and it just is constantly sucking the fluid, not just the fluid from the ovary, but also the body fluid from the body cavity into that, and it comes in and then goes into the fallopian tube or the oviduct. So probably a better picture to see this would be this diagram right here. So we can see the ovary, and then this would be the fallopian tube or the uterine tube or the oviduct. Now, one of the things about this is, like all of our organs, it isn't just simply floating around in our body cavity, but remember that we have mesenteries. And so mesenteries are sheets of connective tissue which kind of hold things in place, right? So you saw that when you dissected open your rat, and you saw the like the digestive organs all situated. In order to actually look at them, you had to kind of break those mesenteries, right? And so here you can see that there is mesenteries that surround that and hold it in place, and that there's also blood vessels that supply. So if you're wondering, well, how does the ovary, if it's just kind of out here on its own, how does it get a blood supply? The blood vessels actually travel via the mesenteries. So once the egg is in the oviduct, it then must be fertilized. So if an embryo is to be produced, the egg must be fertilized in the oviduct. And that's just simply, we'll talk about pregnancy, and we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about reproductive technologies as well. But this is just simply because the egg and the sperm have a lifespan. And if it takes too long for the egg to get to the uterus, so what that means is that the sperm actually has to travel up through the vagina, up through the cervix, up through the uterus, up through the fallopian tube, through that narrow point of the isthmus, and then it fertilizes the egg someplace up in here. We have fertilization taking place. Okay. Now, sometimes we get what is called an ectopic pregnancy. So this means that the embryo does not implant in the right place. So the embryo implants somewhere other than the uterus. So does anybody know what it's called when it implants in the oviduct? So it doesn't go, it just kind of stays there and it'll implant into the lining of the oviduct. Yeah, tubal pregnancy, okay? So you can have a tubal pregnancy. And this can be very dangerous because it could cause the oviduct to rupture and it could get infected, right? And so it could actually lead to death. And so generally what they do these days is they would go in and they would remove the embryo, and then you would probably have some scar tissue in here, and that probably would decrease the likelihood of the female becoming pregnant again, but she has another ovary. I imagine in the old times, females sometimes survived that. If it ruptured and then scar tissue formed right here, then they probably were less fertile because of it, but they might have been able to survive a tubal pregnancy.
So with having two, you know, why is not having more than just one kid at a time more popular? Because if you were to have one be fertilized in each.
Yes, like and a lot of animals, like animals that have litters, right? They don't have a single uterus. They actually have a bifurcated uterus. So they have uterine horns. And so they do produce, babies from both. And so we have two.
But it's just one?
You only really need one.
Per cycle.
Yes, but I'm trying to figure out why we didn't get rid of that second one, because we don't really need a second one if we have one.
Because would they still be considered twins if you had one fertile in each?
Yes, they're still fraternal twins.
Okay.
So they wouldn't be identical twins, because if there's an egg ovulated from this one and an egg ovulated from this one, they would both come down here and implant in the same uterus.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But, the question is, why didn't we just, I guess, they're,
Because then it wouldn't be symmetrical and it would look funny.
Yeah.
Probably what
I mean, not that it
Yeah, so you
does
might not be as
look
fertile.
funny, but like,
But realistically, it's probably.
So occasionally, but very rarely, we have known that the baby or the embryo at this point, can leave the fallopian tube and go into the body cavity. And so this is the pelvic abdominal cavity. So you could actually possibly get the embryo leaving the reproductive tract, right? The embryo implanting in the body cavity. And it generally wouldn't survive there for very long, right? But they have known of this to occur. Now there is the reason for this, again, is because the oviduct is not directly connected to the ovary, okay? So there is another condition which is relatively common for whatever reason, or can be relatively common in certain populations, and that is where we get uterine tissue from the uterus coming up into the oviduct and then out, right? So you can get what is called endometriosis. And so this doesn't have to do with pregnancy, but this is where you get uterine tissue adhering to the organs in the abdominal cavity. So we'll talk about the endometrium. The reason why it's called endometriosis is the endometrium is the lining of the uterus that thickens every month, right? And then if pregnancy doesn't happen, then it sloughs off. So there's a hypothesis, and this is actually the reason why if you're in gym class, they say, oh, if you're having your period, don't go upside down. So there's some concern that if you go upside down, if you do inversions, that you might actually cause the menstrual fluid, which has endometrial cells, to go the wrong way, right? And to come out. And then that becomes very painful, because what happens when people have this is every month, the lining that is on the organs in the body cavity expands, right? And it causes a supposedly great amount of pain. It's super painful. And so some women actually go in to have surgery and they actually have to scrape, right, that uterine tissue out of their body. And so to remove it so that it doesn't do that and cause all kinds of problems with adhesions, because that kind of sticks everything together and it can cause problems. There's another hypothesis for this, however, I want to mention that some people or some scientists think that some cases of endometriosis is due to displaced tissue during embryonic development. So if a person has endometriosis, it might be that when they were developing, during embryonic development, there was tissue put in the wrong spot and it is responding inappropriately to hormonal signals and expanding and dying off during the monthly reproductive cycle of the female.
So how does that interfere with fertilization, or does it?
It doesn't. It just makes your life hell, I guess. It's just like,
It just makes pregnancy more painful.
Yeah, I would imagine it makes pregnancy more painful too. Okay. Oops. We want to go back.
The last thing
Okay.
I was told it was incurable, so.
No, you can have surgery.
You can have surgery, yes. Yep. Okay. So the uterus is also sometimes referred to as the womb. And this is where the embryo implants. So where embryo should implant. And we're going to talk about implantation. And the embryo essentially produces digestive enzymes and digests its way into that lining and then kind of feeds off the secretions of the lining until the blood vessels are formed, which create the placenta. We also have the cervix, and the cervix is the barrier between the vagina and the uterus. And the cervix produces mucus. And it creates a plug when ovulation is not happening. Oops, ovulation. Okay. So you know that when a baby is to be born, the cervix actually has to thin and it has to dilate. So when they talk about like it thinning and when dilation happens, right, that's opening up to allow the baby to move into the birth canal and then out through the vagina. But the cervix also plays a role because it prevents sperm from getting up into, and other bad things, from getting up into the upper reaches of the female's reproductive tract. So it protects against infection. And then when the female's not ovulating, obviously, you don't need sperm up there. And so it's kind of interesting mechanism. When we have an increase in estrogen levels in the body, when we're going to talk about the hormonal cycles, when we increase the estrogen levels, then this thins the plug, thins the mucus, and sperm can move through. There's some contraceptives that help to prevent sperm from getting up into the, through the cervix. And so you can have a cervical cap, right, that you can place, or a diaphragm that you can place that prevents the sperm from getting up into the cervix. Okay, so then we have the vagina. And the vagina is the birth canal. But it is also where the penis is inserted. And the vagina is composed of stratified, squamous, So what does that mean? Stratified means many layers of what? Flat cells, right? So this is the same thing that lines our mouth. It's actually the same thing that lines our esophagus. It's the same thing that lines our outside of our skin, right? So this is for friction, right? This is against protection against friction. So this is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. And this epithelial tissue secretes glycogen. So what type of molecule is glycogen? Is it a protein, a carbohydrate, a lipid, or a nucleic acid? It's a carbohydrate. So it is energy. It is food, right? So one of the really interesting things about the vagina is that it secretes this glycogen and it feeds symbiotic bacteria. So symbiotic bacteria are good bacteria that live in the female's reproductive tract. And this makes the vagina acidic. So it makes the vagina acidic. Now, really, the vagina is only acidic when a female is of reproductive age. So it's kind of interesting because pre-puberty, so if you think about girls before they hit puberty, and then also post-menopausal, which would be older women who have stopped their reproductive cycles, they tend to have less acidic vaginas, which actually makes it so they're actually more predisposed to infections, including yeast infections. So this acidic environment seems to be really important in reproductive females because it plays a couple of roles. One is it protects against bad bacteria and fungus. And these might gain entry during copulation. Okay. But it also kills weak sperm. So a lot of sperm will actually die. But you'll remember that the seminal fluid is basic and it's very alkaline. And so it actually helps to neutralize the acid. But if it's really acidic, then some of the sperm, and this is one of the reasons why humans have to produce millions of sperm, 5 to 10 millions of sperm per teaspoon or something like per 5 mils, in order for them to be fertile. Because a lot of the sperm have to die when they get into the acidic environment in order for some sperm to be able to make it through, and they have to swim through the mucus of the cervix and then up through the uterus and then into the fallopian tube for fertilization to take place. Okay. So then this becomes a particular problem when females take antibiotics. So if you're a female and you take antibiotics, sometimes the doctor who has given you antibiotics will also prescribe you a fungicide, right? Because they know that the antibiotics kill off all bacteria, even the good ones. Right? So this is going to increase the pH of the vagina. And an increased pH is going to allow yeast infection.
And it reverses birth control, just in case anybody didn't know.
Reverses?
Antibiotics reverse all birth control.
Oh, even
So
like that pill?
Yeah. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
like if you go in and you just have a cold and they give you amoxicillin, every time they tell me, they'll be like, do you want us to give you this, what you were saying that will help with yeast infections and stuff. And then they'll also be like, if you're on birth control, don't be sexually active while you're on it because it reverses all of it too.
Huh, what if it's only that one type of?
It might be, I don't know, but every time I've gotten an antibiotic since I was like 16, they've told me that. Be careful.
They've never told me that. That's interesting. Okay, so yes.
When in doubt.
When in doubt.
Be careful if you're on antibiotics.
Yes. And maybe that also, it decreases the pH, so it's going to be more sperm are going to be able to survive.
Yeah.
right? So that might increase your likelihood of the sperm surviving. Okay, so sometimes you can treat this. So fungicides probably aren't the best things to put in your body. So you can treat this kind of more naturally through taking acidophilus. So you probably have seen this in the grocery store, but acidophilus is lactobacilli. So this is the same type of bacteria that is found in the vagina. And so supposedly you can take it internally, so you can take acidophilus pills, which have living bacteria in them. But this is also found in yogurt. So when they say yogurt has live cultures, that means that there's live bacteria in there, and that can be good for recolonizing not just the vagina, but the whole reproductive tract, because you've killed off all of your good microbes in your digestive system as well. So that's why you have to be really concerned about taking too many antibiotics. So like when I was a kid, if you went to the doctor and paid money and you didn't come out with antibiotics, you felt like you were ripped off, right? Yeah. They gave them out every time you went in because they wanted you to feel like you got something. Because if you went in and they knew it was a virus, they would say, oh, it's just a virus. You just have to go home and you know, it'll get better in a week. You know, that was just not sufficient because they thought that people were going to go to other doctors, right? But now doctors do not want to prescribe antibiotics. So I can go in and sometimes I get so frustrated because I'll have a sinus infection for like months. And I'll go in and I say, please, can you just give me some antibiotics? I can't take it anymore. And he's like, nope, sorry. It's like, okay. Back to like rinsing my sinuses with my salt water, right?
Went to the doctor a couple months ago and they kind of gave me the same song and dance. And she's like, well, let's try and put you on these like vitamins. I said, no. I said, I'm in here. Give me amoxicillin. I'll be better in 3 days. And she just kind of looked at me. I said, I need to go back to work. And she's like, oh. So she wrote me amoxicillin. I'm like, it's amoxicillin. It's not like I'm asking for Vicodin or something crazy. Like,
well, you know, there is a concern that we're going to create these superbugs that are resistant to antibiotics and then are not going to work. And there's a big concern because in other countries, like in, you know, some countries, like even I think in Mexico, you can go to the drugstore and they'll give you like 2 antibiotics, 2 pills, right? And it's like, excuse me, you know, that's going to like kill off the weak bacteria, but the strong bacteria are going to come back, you know. And so it's kind of like the big picture is that you shouldn't, you know, you should try to avoid antibiotics. Anyway. So yogurt can be used orally, but it can also be used, you could put actually yogurt, right, on the outside of your reproductive tract if you're a female, right? So you can treat it, right, put it near the vagina or maybe even in the vagina, right? And it will help to cure yeast infections because it is acidic and it has good bacteria in it. My caveat with that is that do not get anything added, like do not get the
I was just saying like blueberries.
No blueberries. We're talking about plain, no sugar, no honey.
Today, like
vanilla or strawberry banana.
Plain yogurt. Plain. Yeah.
Well, what is that other stuff too? It's kefir or something like that?
Kefir is fermented milk, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and kefir actually also has some good fungi in it for your digestive tract, which makes, if you've ever had kefir, I used to make kefir on my countertop, and it was really good because it was almost carbonated like champagne because it's got a yeast in it, and so it gets frothy and it's kind of bubbly.
Is it chunky? Like
it's a little bit chunky, but not too chunky.
Do you just leave it out? I don't get like.
So you take milk. You take milk. You add a mixture of all the good microbes and the yeast, and then you put an airlock in it, just like when you're making beer.
Is that how you make kombucha as well?
Oh. So you put an airlock in it so the good bad microbes from the air can't get in, and then you just leave it for a few days, and it ferments. And
you should bring us some.
I know.
I'm
like,
good.
I'm interested.
Yeah.
Okay. I like some kombucha.
I don't like the little chunks. That's weird. Like
That's
little
my
seeds.
favorite part.
I think do I chew it? Do I drink it? I'm not sure.
Don't chew it.
The mucusy stuff.
Yeah, it does. It's like when you're sick and you swallow your
Yeah, it is
snot.
mucus. Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, you get the little scratches on your throat from the seeds.
Okay, so external genitalia Remember that the male has only 2 openings. So his reproductive and his urinary tract fused, right, during embryonic development. The females did not. So the female has 3 openings, right? So they have the opening to the vagina, which is located in the center. This is the urethral orifice. So this is where the urine comes out, right? And then this is obviously the anus where the feces come out. And then the clitoris sits above that. So we have 3 openings in the female. You have the vagina, the anus, and the urethral orifice. So when we look at the external anatomy, we can see that the female has a structure, and we're going to talk about this, the homologous structure. This is what is referred to as the clitoris. And the clitoris has erectile tissue in it. So just like with the male, this tissue, upon being stimulated, will fill with blood. You'll notice that there are also glands. So that greater vestibular gland produces vaginal fluids. So vaginal fluids are kind of, well, they would be analogous to the pre-seminal fluid that is produced by the male. So the greater vestibular gland is homologous to the bulbal urethral gland. So we'll say the greater vestibular. And the reason why it's called vestibular is the whole opening to the female's reproductive system in the labia and the clitoris, that is called the vestibule. So the greater vestibular gland produces vaginal secretions. Okay, so this would be homologous, so it's of the same embryonic origin to the male oval urethral gland. So when we look at the female's anatomy, they're starting to rethink the way that it is represented, because it looks like the clitoris is a much smaller organ than the male's penis, which it is in general, but it is actually much bigger when we actually look at its structure and look at all the erectile tissue. So if we look at another diagram of it, so this is the clitoris, and this is something that they don't show in your textbook, but I think they're thinking about drawing them. And this is the erectile tissue coming down, right? And so if we compare this to the male, right? So this would be the female's erectile tissue, and then this is all of the male's erectile tissue. So the female's erectile tissue is more than just the clitoris, right? And so this would be perhaps what some people call the origin of the G spot, because this would be near the vagina. So when the male's penis enters the vagina, it could press against the erectile tissue of those arms of the female's erectile tissue. It could also kind of explain why it is hard to urinate. Men obviously know when they have an erection, it's very hard to urinate, but also females, when they are excited, it is also hard for them to urinate. Okay, so if we look at the female's sexual response, we can talk about the nervous system. And so remember, it is the sympathetic division that causes erection. So the clitoris becomes erect, but also the internal erectile tissue becomes erect. And then it is the parasympathetic division that causes orgasm.
So is that opposite of?
No, it's the same. So you have to have those occurring in the right order.
But the males is opposite.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be.
Well,
Is
that's
it?
how it's written.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Because the
Okay, let me look at my
As
notes.
soon as you said that.
Yeah, it says parasympathetic.
Oh, it does say that. Yeah, that's
Oh,
why
shoot.
this morning I was like, what? This is making
But it is that, right?
I'm
No,
thinking
I
about
think
it.
it's the other.
No, yeah, this makes more sense because if you.
Well,
No, I think it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, I would
Yeah, like.
consider
So it is the
like, it's
opposite.
right.
Yeah, so it's the same, sorry. So this would be, I think this is parasympathetic.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll look it up, but I'm pretty sure. You know,
That
that's
makes-
the amazing
I think
thing
that
about
makes more
Google.
sense.
it.
This is like,
sympathetic.
I thought you had to be relaxed.
Well, I feel
Well,
like,
you're not.
Yeah. Sympathetic would.
Well, because
Oh,
it's
having an argument here. Okay, I can't get Google to come up, so I'll look it up, but I'm pretty sure that this is the way it is. Okay, so orgasm used to be thought to be insignificant in females.
Of course it
Okay. One of the things about orgasm is this causes vaginal contractions. So when we think about reproduction, vaginal contractions are sometimes important for conception because these help to move the sperm up into the reproductive tract. Okay. So if this is the case, then it might be important to have the male ejaculate first, if you were trying to get pregnant, and then the female to have the orgasm second, which might explain why females are harder to reach, seem to be. I'm sure they've tested this or looked at it. Who was it? Johnson & Johnson that did all the research on the sexual response?
Baby powder thing?
Well, they want
Well, they want to stay in business.
And so, the orgasm should happen after the ejaculation, which might be why it's harder for females to orgasm typically than it is for males to orgasm.
Okay, I looked it up, and it is, the parasympathetic is erection.
Okay, so it was right. Okay, thank you.
Because I just wanted,
Okay.
so we did learn.
Okay. Also, they think that these vaginal contractions might help to, and the uterus can actually contract too, so you can also have uterine contractions. And this is actually why, if you're a midwife, you would know this, because sometimes if you want the female to go into labor or to hurry up and get through labor, if you can get them to have an orgasm, the vaginal contractions will be stronger, so they might be more likely to push the baby out. Yeah.
So I know this is kind of off topic, but I read that women used to be diagnosed with hysteria and they would go into like a clinical doctor and that was, the orgasm was the treatment for hysteria. They would get an orgasm from their doctor to be less hysterical.
Wasn't there a movie about that? I think they made a movie about it. They did make a movie about that. Yes, I think that did happen. But they also diagnosed women with hysteria and then gave them a hysterectomy.
Oh, they just took it all away.
Yeah. So they would so if you were hysterical, the doctors thought if they just took out all the female organs, then you could treat hysteria, and that's why it's called a hysterectomy. Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm gonna stop there, and we will talk about the similarities between the male and the female's external reproductive organs on Wednesday. And did everybody got a review sheet, right?
Yeah.
Oh, and I did the review. And I did you want to take the quiz?
Yeah.
You want to get a review sheet for Caitlin?
Yeah.
Oh, did you ready? Oh.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So like I've heard, okay, so HPV is a form of like herpes, correct? But it also causes cancer, right? But somebody, one of my friends when I was in high school had gotten it, and they said that their doctor said that it was from having multiple partners, that it can be like their fluids mixed or something.
It is a sexually transmitted virus,
Right.
but it just increases your likelihood of getting it if you have multiple sexual partners. Multiple sexual partners do not cause it.
I
But see, if you have a lot, if you have sex with a lot of different people, if you have sex with a lot of different people, your chance of getting it increases
I see,
because
that makes sense, that makes sense.
it's not their things
The way
mixing
it was
inside of
told to
you.
me, I was like, does their stuff stay there?
We should just look it up because she's not sure about that now, so.
Well, I looked it up and that's what it said, but you might just want to look up it because it was kind of confusing. It's a parasitic. I don't know.
I'm sure I just can't remember at the moment. I think it's the NyQuil.
It's the night.
I had to take so much NyQuil last night to make it through the night. I was all propped up in bed, sleeping, just sitting straight up.
So that you didn't
Because I couldn't
have to
breathe.
cough as much.
And every time I'd lay down, I'd cough.
I have sinusitis, I've had it since I was young, but I have one nostril that's literally half the size of the other one, and they tried to correct it with surgery, but it didn't work. Like, I can actually look in the mirror and see it, like, one nostril is huge, and the other one's little. But I don't breathe through my nose at all.
Oh.
Yeah, we were talking
I
about,
never
we were
do.
talking about the ureters and urethra and how sometimes, oh, I think I already told you. I'm having deja vu. I think I already told you. One of my clients gets a steel pipe shoved. Yeah, okay. Crazy. Yeah.
Okay.